Well, good morning. My name is Taylor Randall, and I'm Dean of the David Eccles School of Business. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this installment of our series on how to navigate COVID-19. Today, we're taking a bit of a pivot. We're focusing on how you're going to rebuild your business and reactivate our community. We're coming to you from the Mariner S. Eccles Institute of Economics and Quantitative Analysis. For those of you that don't know, Mariner Eccles was a historic figure in the economic development of our country as he led the Federal Reserve as we moved our way out of the Great Depression. We're thrilled to be broadcasting this to the businesses in the state of Utah and beyond, thanks to a generous donation from the George S. and Dolores Dory Eccles Foundation. What you're going to hear today is an intellectual collaboration between Levitt Partners, the Cynosure Group, and the faculty here at the University of Utah. We're also very, very grateful for the collaboration and partnership of the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce and the Economic Task Force headed by the governor of this state. Today, we're going to talk about an economic forecast that you can actually do something with. And we've got some great experts. Our panel today will be moderated by the former governor of the state of Utah, Mike Levitt. Mike also led Health and Human Services and is planned for pandemics like these. So Mike, why don't you take the screen?
Well, thank you, Taylor, and welcome to everyone to how to rebuild your business and how to rebuild our community. As the Dean mentioned, we have a very interesting conversation today, and it's going to be led by a discussion with an esteemed economist, Mark Zandi, who was with Moody's Analytics. I'll introduce him in just a moment. But also, we're going to hear from Natalie Gochner, who is director of the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. But I do want to remind you that this is an interactive conversation and that there'll be lots of opportunity for questions. And the way you ask a question is to look at the bottom of your screen, and you will see a chat function. And we'd like you to use the chat function to list your questions, and we'll get to them toward the end of our hour. So I'd now like to formally introduce our speaker. Joining us today is Mark Zandia, who is the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, where he directs economic research for a very esteemed institution. His firm, Moody's Analytics, also provides economic forecasting for the state of Utah. So it impacts our lives and for Utah's government leaders. He has authored 2 books on recovery, and he is a guest on many television shows, and you have undoubtedly seen him. Mark, we're delighted that our audience today that you can join us, and we've got some questions for you. Welcome.
Thanks, Governor. It's a pleasure to be with you. I want to thank you. I want to thank Natalie and everyone at the University of Utah for the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you so much.
So, Mark, like the rest of us, it looks like you're working from home. Where is home for you?
Well, I'm actually in my bedroom in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I live very close to, maybe folks know Villanova. Villanova, we've won the national basketball championship a couple times. So I grew up a mile from there. I tease my kids, I have 3 kids, that I have always sheltered in place. I've not moved.
Mark, you have been advising the state of Utah a long time. I recall during the period I was governor that we depended on your instincts and your forecasts and your analysis. And so it's a pleasure to see you again, and I'm delighted for a chance to talk with you. Obviously, we're in a period of a great both local and national and international disruption with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd love to just hear your basic thoughts on the pandemic and the economic fallout that's become a big part of our lives.
Sure. Well, it's a huge blow to the economy, unprecedented. There's really no historical analog to this. And it's really 2 blows. The first is a blow on the supply side of the economy. That's business shutdowns that we've experienced throughout much of the nation. And we're just now starting to reopen business. But for the last 6 weeks, businesses in much of the country have been on lockdown. And of course, that there's nothing that comes close to that. The only thing I can think of perhaps is 9/11, when the economy was disrupted but that was for a day or two. This is going on for weeks. And then there's also a demand side shock, and that is, of course, people are losing their jobs. Millions, tens of millions of people are losing their jobs or hours or wages, and that's making it difficult for them to go out and spend. Businesses are very uncertain, so they pulled back. They're not investing. And of course, international trade has been disrupted. So we've got both the supply side shock and the demand side shock, and the numbers are, nationwide. They're just, just off the charts. I mean, I'll get to give you a sense of the numbers, and then I'll stop. In April, which I guess if there is good news, I think April will be the apex of the shock. This will be the very worst of it. We lost nationwide 20 to 25 million jobs. Now that will wipe out all of the job gains that we experienced during the long previous economic expansion, record long expansion. And unemployment will be somewhere between 15 and 20%. We'll get these data points next week, but somewhere between 15 and 20%. And you have to go all the way back to the depression of the 1930s to find unemployment that high. And again, I don't know that does justice to the financial pain and suffering. So this is a body blow to the economy that is just unprecedented from every perspective.
Mark, I'm assuming your thought that this is the apex, that April is the apex of this body blow. That must assume then that you see the economy beginning to get better. That if we start now into this reopening, business goes back, and if there's suddenly a surge of viruses, the virus surges, we get a surge of illnesses, and things get worse. I'm assuming that your forecast of an apex in April is assuming that things are going to get better.
Yeah, I mean, the key is the business reopenings, which it's a process. So this will take place over the next 2 to 3 months, and the economy will come back to life. Now, I will say, it's not going to get back to where it was anytime soon. This is going to be a long process. It's going to be a bit of a slog. And I don't think the economy is going to kick into any kind of gear until we have some kind of vaccine that's widely distributed. So this will take some time. But I do think the worst of the shock will be this month. And then by July 4th, going into the end of the summer, I would expect that business conditions would be better. A lot does depend on the epidemiology of the virus. If we have a second wave or a third wave, I do think if that happens, and I think a prudent planner would probably plan for that possibility, because that seems very likely. It will do damage. So again, and I'm not thinking this economy is going to come roaring back, but I don't think we're going to shut down again. I would be surprised if we go down that route. We'll probably try to navigate through, make sure that the most vulnerable are sheltering in place, that we've got all that we need in terms of hospital capacity and all the equipment we need. And then we'll just try to, we'll do our very best to navigate through without a shutdown. So I don't think this is going to be a straight line, but I think, the very worst of unemployment, the very worst of the job loss, the loss to profitability, the hit to stock prices, that all happened in the month of April.
What's your thought about job creation? When are we going to start seeing some positive job numbers? Will that will it just flatten out essentially for a while, or will we actually start to see job gains at some point? And if so, when?
Yeah, we'll see job gains. So once businesses reopen, they'll start to rehire. That probably won't be the month of May, because the survey that the Bureau of Labor Statistics conducts to calculate employment includes the week of the 12th of the month. So by next week or next couple of weeks, businesses aren't going to be back hiring. So May will probably see some further job loss. But by June, July, August, going into September, I would expect to see significant job gains. Now, remember, I said we're going to lose 20, 25 million in April. We'll probably lose another couple million in May. So if you told me by election day, November, we got half those jobs back, that sounds about right to me. But we're not going to get all those jobs back. That's going to take a while to get that's going to take at least 2, 3, 4 years before we get all those jobs back.
Could you put this in some historic perspective? I mean, we've all read about the Great Depression. Many of us will very freshly remember the liquidity crisis. Where does this line up in terms of economic events in the last 100 years?
Sure. Yeah. So let's look at unemployment. So let's say the unemployment rate peaks somewhere between 15 and 20%. For context, in the financial crisis, that was the Great Recession we went through a little over 10 years ago. The peak unemployment rate nationwide was 10% on the nose. That was in early 2010. We hit 10% in the early 1980s. That was a time of very high inflation. That's when Paul Volcker was chairman of the Federal Reserve, and to wring out that inflation, he raised interest rates aggressively, and that hit the economy. So we saw 10% unemployment then briefly. And then you have to go all the way back into the 30s before World War II. And for that entire decade of the 30s, unemployment was double digit. That's why we call that a depression. So there's no official definition of depression, but a depression, I think in most people's nomenclature, would be double digit unemployment for more than 2 to 3 years. That was a depression. The all-time high in unemployment was 1933, when we had a 25% unemployment rate. So, we're going to be in that ballpark. I mean, particularly if you include the underemployed. So to be considered unemployed, you have to be out of work and you have to be actively searching for a job. But of course, in this environment, many people can't be actively searching, so they won't even be counted as unemployed. So if you consider those folks, in addition to the actual unemployed, we're looking at numbers that are probably pretty close to 25%. So, very consistent with the depths of the Great Depression in 1933. Now, I don't want to overstate the case. I mean, that was a whole decade of extremely high unemployment, lots of financial pain and suffering. This is a brief, in a historical context, month or two, but it does give you a sense of the magnitudes here. This is, something just off the charts, a 1 in 100-year event.
Again, in the context of just perspective, we had a great session in this series with Randy Quarles, who, of course, is the supervisor of banks and on the Federal Reserve Board, and a great contributor. We talked about fiscal policy and monetary policy, the differences and the way both are being deployed in this moment. I'd like to get your reaction to the sum total of that. I mean, when you consider that we're into $2.5 trillion of fiscal stimulus, we've got another $2.5 trillion in monetary policy impacts. We're going to have a deficit, clearly, because of lack of revenue in the national government and states and so forth, because of lack of spending and economic activity. We're going to have more expenses than we have before, so the deficit's going to be startling. And it's probably going to be a deficit for a couple of years. So we could be talking about $8 trillion over time added to the debt. Can you just talk a little bit about that? And do we have the capacity as a country to manage that kind of increased debt load?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say a couple things. First, I think it's very important in a time of crisis like the one we're in for policymakers, Reserve and lawmakers, Congress and the administration, to be very aggressive in their response. Both, and I think they have to so far. You mentioned the Federal Reserve. They've lowered interest rates to zero. They're buying bonds to keep long-term rates down. They're eased requirements on banks so that banks continue to provide credit. They've erected many different credit facilities to keep credit flowing. They've effectively become a firewall between the problems in the economy and the financial system. And so far, they've kept the financial system from being infected by what's going on in the economy, which is very different than what happened in the financial crisis. And that's very, very important. And they've succeeded. Lawmakers have also been very muscular in their response. If you total up all of what they've provided in fiscal rescue, it's about $3 trillion. So that's close to 15% of GDP. For context, if you go back to the financial crisis, during the crisis in the years just following that, add up all of the stimulus, that was 10% of GDP. Now, in my view, this was absolutely necessary because if the lawmakers and the Fed had not responded this way, we would have suffered and would certainly suffer a depression, double-digit unemployment for many years. The hit to our fiscal situation would be even worse. So we had no choice. It was a Hobson's choice. There's no good choice here. We took the least bad choice, and that was we had to respond. But the second thing I'll say is, to your point, now we're left with massive deficits and much higher debt loads. Just to give you a number, if you go before the financial crisis, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s into the 2000s, the average national debt to GDP ratio was 40%. After the financial crisis, it doubled to 80%. We made no progress in the good times back before this crisis addressing that. We just punted on that. Bad policy, but we did that. Now we're looking at a debt to GDP ratio that's going to be 120% when it's all said and done. And to give you context there, the all-time record high was immediately after World War II. We hit 120% debt to GDP. And I don't think that's sustainable. We do need to address that on the other side of this crisis. Now, hopefully we have the political will to do that. We have not shown that. We did not show that after the financial crisis. But I'm hopeful on the other side of this that we will be able to connect the dots between deficits, debt, and how corrosive it is on our long-term growth prospects, and how it makes us vulnerable to anything else that goes wrong. I mean, who's to say we're not going to have another whatever pandemic, war? Things happen, as we know. You and I have seen plenty of bad things happen in our lifetime, and we need to be prepared for that. Climate change is another good example, something we need to prepare for. And so we need to address this. And, I'm hopeful that on the other side of this, we will. I'll say one last thing, and that is we may not have any choice, because what's going to happen in all likelihood is we're going to get on the other side of this 2, 3, 4 years down the road. And financial markets, global financial markets, are going to focus on this because the entire world is taking on a lot of debt. It's not just us. In fact, we're in a better fiscal situation than almost anyone else on the planet, right? So the global investors are just going to have a very difficult time managing all of this debt that is everywhere across the globe. And there's going to be tremendous pressure, I think, on all governments, including our own, to get our fiscal house in order. So that's something we're going to have to address down the road.
There have been occasions when I've had opportunity to ask economists like you about the deficit and how ultimately the political system does come to a reckoning with this. And they often said to me, about the only way out of this is inflation, to kind of inflate your way out. Are there other alternatives? I mean, obviously you can raise taxes, you can cut government spending, but those have not proven to be particularly viable options, at least not often deployed. We've been through one presidential election where the deficit was not even an election, and I think we're going to go through another, and I don't see it being a big campaign issue for either of the parties. Long term, where does this go?
Yeah, I don't think trying to inflate your way out is a prescription for success long run. I mean, that's just going to make your economy even more diminished. Businesses won't invest. Your underlying growth rates will slow. In the long run, you will lose. I mean, there have been economies, particularly in the emerging world, have tried that road. It's a very bad road. It ends in a very bad place. So hopefully we do that. And I don't think the Federal Reserve will allow that to happen. Fortunately, they're an independent agency. They work really hard to get inflation down. They're not going to, they may allow for a little higher inflation for a while, when we're in this period of concerns about deflation and disinflation, but I don't think they're going to allow that to happen. The only way is the obvious, and you mentioned it. It's going to require both tax increases and spending restraint. You can't do it any other way. And the question is, how do we generate the political will to come to that conclusion? And the only way, in my mind, that happens is if we're forced to do that. And that means global investors are going to have to say enough, and interest rates rise and say, look, you have to address this, or you're going to go down you're going to this is going to break. Your interest payments on your debt are going to be larger than your defense budget. Now, nobody wants that, so we're going to have to fix this problem. And by the way, this has happened historically. I mean, this is the way it works. I remember back in there are many cases, but I remember one case historically in the 1990s. Bill Clinton was elected president. His instinct was to step on the accelerator, spending, he was going to spend a lot more money. Bob Rubin was the Treasury Secretary, said, Mr. President, that's a really bad idea because deficits are going to rise and interest rates will rise. And remember the bond market vigilantes, they came in and they saw what Clinton was doing. Interest rates spiked and Clinton reversed. And by the end of the 1990s, we had a surplus. Remember, Al Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, was testifying before Congress saying our biggest problem, this is hard to believe, but our biggest problem is we're going to run out of treasury bonds. That was our problem. So,
well, we do see other countries who are wrestling with the same issues. You mentioned Asia and the European economies having similar kinds of situations and not being in a better position than we are. How do we look? One of the problems is that investors are looking at alternatives. Do they have alternatives for their money? What do European and Asian markets look like by comparison?
Well, Europe's in a world of hurt. We got problems. Their problems are overwhelming. I worry in their specific case that they're going to have another problem with keeping the Eurozone together. Unemployment is starting to rise again. Each European nation has a strong political party that is very Eurosceptic. Much like the British and Brexit, you have those kinds of instincts in many of the European countries. So I think Europe is going to have to fight for its life. The Eurozone is going to have to fight for its life, in the next few years. And they've got negative interest rates and they've got debt loads that are much higher than ours, and they're rising very rapidly because they're also responding to this. So I think Europe is really, that's probably the weakest link in the global economy going forward. Asia, a different story. They are in much better financial shape. Take the Chinese, their federal debt, if you take their federal government debt, they've got local government debt problems, but their federal government debt is probably 50% of debt to GDP. So they still have resources that they can use. So they're in a better financial position and they're more competitive. But of course, they are very export oriented. They depend on the rest of the world for their growth. And so if Europe is struggling and the emerging markets are struggling, then they're going to struggle as well. So, they've got more room to maneuver, but they don't have a lot more room to maneuver.
So let's turning back to the crisis at hand here. We've been characterizing this in our earlier sessions as just being a new risk that people have to learn to manage, that we're not likely to have a one and done solution here, that we're going to have to work our way through this and balance this whole health and economic impact thing. We've been talking about it as though you walk out on an icy lake, not knowing for sure how thick the ice is, and we just do it a step at a time. Is that an analysis you agree with, and is that the right approach?
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think this is going to go away. The virus is not. We could get lucky. We could get a vaccine early. We could get treatment that reduces the health risks here. But a prudent plan. The folks in Utah are great planners. Would not plan on that, and they would prepare for the eventuality that this is a problem that's going to be with us for the foreseeable future. And as such, it does require that people learn how to adjust. We have to learn, our health care systems need to adjust, our businesses need to adjust. And that's going to be trial and error. We're going to have to figure it out, in each industry, each business is going to be different. They got different circumstances and they pose different risks. And so to mitigate those risks will require different approaches. I do think it would be useful for all of us to really look at Asia as a guidepost, because the Asians are 2 months ahead of us in many cases. And they've got many different stories. I've got an office in Singapore. Singapore just shut down again. They had a second wave. They shut down again. They're not going to open up until June. Whereas you go up to Taiwan or into Korea, they've been very aggressive in the lockdowns, and that's worked quite well, and they've been able to manage through much better. But every case study is a good case study for us to examine to help us understand what kinds of things we should be doing and what kinds of things we should not be doing. One thing I want to say about Utah. Utah is probably as well positioned of any state in the country to manage through this. In fact, we at Moody's do analysis of which economies across the country are going to get hit hardest by this virus, and which economies across the country are going to be least affected. And of all the 50 states, Utah is the second least affected, New Hampshire being the least affected. And we look at a lot of different measures. We look at how exposed to tourism, travel, how exposed to the virus, poverty rates, travel, airline industry, demographics, reliance on people moving in and moving out, and all based on all those factors, Utah is doing very well. And if you look across the state, St. George is the most exposed, as you can imagine, because of the travel industry. Salt Lake, and just to give you a sense of that, there's 400 metropolitan areas across the country, roughly. St. George is ranked being the most affected, and that's, let's say, New York City. St. George is ranked 100. Salt Lake is 250, 300, and Provo is very much near the bottom. It's there's only 5 or 6 other metropolitan areas in the country that are better metropolitan areas that are better positioned to handle through this. So I think one encouraging thing to take away from this is that your state is well positioned to navigate through, particularly given how careful you've been in your planning to prepare for the possibility that this virus is going to be with us for some time.
Well, that's very good news. Thank you. And a high compliment to our state and its culture. 2 final questions. First, if you're a small business person in this state and you were doing some planning, what would you do? And then secondly, maybe you can meet the theme of our gathering today, which is a forecast you can use. What would your forecast be?
Okay, so I think as a small business person, you need to be very proactive in many regards, but 2 key regards. The first is to make sure you completely understand and avail yourself of all of the resources that are available to you. And they're changing all the time. There's coming from the federal government, I'm sure from the state and local governments. It's a bit of a mess just because things are being invented on the fly and changing, literally in real time, because policymakers are trying to figure out what works best and how to implement it most effectively. But you need to be on top of that. And it's also very advisable to be in close contact with your banker, your friendly banker, figure out who that is. If that banker isn't friendly enough, go find another one. And what I have found that, generally smaller bankers, community bankers are the most effective in trying to help small business navigate through the blizzard of government policies that are available to businesses. You also have to be incredibly persistent, meaning don't give up. The website crashed. Yeah, you're not getting the phone call back. You just keep at it. You just got to keep doing that. The second thing I would suggest is you very proactive in really thinking about how your business can be hardened to manage through this period. Exactly, it depends on the business. Are you a restaurant? Are you a movie theater? Are you a barber shop? Or are you a local bank? Who are you, and what are you doing, and how do you relate and interact with your customer, and how should you organize yourself so that you mitigate any risk that your customers might get sick if they come into your establishment, and really think, how can I help my customer without having them actually come into where I'm, doing my work? Is there a way I can deliver my service to them without, having to have that interaction that might put you and them at some kind of risk? And there's a lot of creative ways of doing that, and you just need to be out there looking at what other people are doing and how they're thinking about this, because that, lots of really interesting ideas. And by the way, I'll say this, the other thing that's going to happen, if you don't do that, you will be left behind, because what's happening is people are figuring out different ways of living and working. And on the other side of this, we are all going to be changed fundamentally. And if you don't change your business model to be consistent with those longer term changes that are occurring, and there are many of them, you're toast. So if you're not toast now, you're going to be toast then. So you need to begin to think about, how am I going to adapt my business, not only to this near term problem we got, but to what will likely be a significant change in the business landscape going forward.
Well, you all heard it. Some great advice from an esteemed economist, Mark Zandia. And Mark, we're delighted that you're with us today. I think you're going to stay with us for a few minutes
Sure,
as we
absolutely.
listen to a good friend of yours and a person that I know you've worked with for a long time. I'm very pleased to bring into our conversation Natalie Gochner, who is director of the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute. Natalie is a trained economist and has been instrumental in a lot of Utah's economic recovery. And Natalie, I just want to thank you very much for joining us today. And I'd like to just build on what we've talked about. You've heard Mark's economic outlook. I'd like you to maybe localize it a little bit. What makes Utah's economic forecast similar? What makes it different?
Happy to do that, Governor Levitt. Thank you for having me on the program. I will just mention that Utah is different and similar. The way we're similar is that our economic structure is much like the nation's. Our employment structure mirrors the nation's. And so that means that these impacts hit us very similar to the nation. How we're different is that we entered this, what Mark characterized as a body blow to the economy. Utah entered it very well positioned. Our unemployment rate going into this was 2.5%. That's the lowest in our history. And then we also have really prepared well in the sense that we have an unemployment insurance trust fund that is great. Over $1 billion at historic levels. Our state has rainy day funds that have been fortified through this expansion. And so, yeah, it's been a really tough hit to the Utah economy, but we entered it in good shape.
Well, I'm sure you were delighted, as was I, to hear Mark talk about Utah in comparison with the rest of the country, and for that matter, the United States in comparison to the rest of the world. We've talked about this event, however, as an economic tsunami that hit Utah at the beginning of mid-March. How does it, from your vantage point, how does it compare to what's happened in the rest of the country?
Governor, I'd like to put up a couple of slides to walk through that. We like to look at unemployment insurance claims when you go into a downturn. They're kind of like a canary in a coal mine. They tell you very quickly what's going on. And Utah's unemployment insurance claims just skyrocketed. We now have about 137,000 unemployed Utahns. It represents about 8% of our workforce. Mark mentioned that in the US, the unemployment claims have wiped out the whole expansion, a long expansion in the US. In Utah, we've wiped out 3 years of job growth in our unemployment claims. So that's been real troubling to us. I have characterized this hit as being very sudden. It's a shock, as very acute in terms of how significant the hit was. And then it's also concentrated. It's concentrated in certain industries, whether it be tourism or fine dining and others that we know well. It's also been concentrated in areas, places that are tourism dependent feel this more acutely. The last thing I'll mention, if we can just go to the next slide, if we look at unemployment claims by week since the start of this in roughly mid-March, we have actually peaked, and our unemployment claims have now dropped for 3 consecutive weeks. And this goes in line with what Mark said, and that is that I think the worst of times for the Utah economy will go down in history as being April 2020. And I expect in the next 60 to 90 days, we'll actually start to see job increases again.
Well, that's really encouraging, I think, for all of us to hear. I know that you've helped lead the creation of Utah's economic response. We refer to it as Utah Leads Together. How does that help us as we begin to walk onto what we've referred to earlier as this this icy lake that we are not sure how thick the ice is?
Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing is it provided for our state a plan. And under Governor Herbert's leadership and with legislative contributions, we actually have not only a plan, but we have a nomenclature, a language for how we think about this. Mark, I don't know how much you've looked at it, but we classified Utah as having an urgent phase. Today's May 1st. Our governor has basically announced that we're now in the stabilization phase. We expect that to go on for several weeks as we figure out, again, walking on the thin ice, what we're dealing with. And then ultimately, we will progress to a recovery phase. But I'm in sync with what Moody's Analytics and Mark Zandi says, that this is going to take time. And I would encourage people to have a 2-year plan as we work through this.
Well, I'd like to ask you, Natalie, the same question I asked Mark. The theme here is a forecast you can use. Let's hear your version.
Happy to do that. I'm going to go to the last of my slides that's called Utah Economic Forecast, and I just made a few points there. The first is that we have reached the peak job loss, and I think that's encouraging. It's not going to feel like it felt last month moving forward, but I do think that we will have what I'll call an employment drag moving forward. That means that people are going to return to a different economy. Some jobs are not going to be there. The economy's changed, and so we'll have an employment drag until we get a treatment or vaccine for this. The second point is we've characterized this as a dial, not a switch. So the reactivation will be gradual, and that's something people need to plan for. The urgent phase lasted about 8 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks. I expect the stabilization phase to last longer than that. I do believe the impacts will be unequal, obviously by industry and even by geography. Our county that has been the hardest hit is Grand County, where Moab is, and then also Garfield County, where our national parks are, and it's because of the tourism exposure. 2 final points. I think it's wise for Utah businesses to plan for some unevenness in the economic forecast. So we've entered the stabilization phase, but we should be prepared for fits and starts as this virus picks its time frame and does what it's going to do, and we try to manage it. So we could have some flare-ups where we're going to have to lock down the economy in a smaller area. I don't think we'll see the blunt impacts we've seen of a statewide, stay home, stay safe kind of order, but we will have some unevenness. And then ultimately we'll enter the recovery phase. And I'm just encouraging people to think of that as a 2-year endeavor. If we get a vaccine by Christmas, like some people are saying, that would be, that would be a very fortunate event. But I think it's wise for businesses right now to think more in terms of a 2-year time frame that you reassess regularly.
Very straightforward. I'd like to bring both of you together, but before I do, and ask a couple of questions, I want to remind our participants today that this is a participatory interaction, and you have the chat function that's right in the middle and the bottom of your screen. And if you click on it and put questions in, we're going to move to questions in just a moment. So if you have questions for Mark or Natalie, please put them there, and we'll be with you in just a moment. I would like to just ask both of you a question. There is this national dialogue that's going on right now involving this tension between economics and health. And if you are healthy, but you're being hurt economically, you tend to see it one way. On the other hand, if you're unhealthy or feeling insecure about your health, and you're not being hurt economically, you see health as a priority. Can you help us square these? What ultimately do we have to accomplish in order to move forward? Mark, would you mind giving some thoughts on that? And then Natalie?
Yeah, I don't view them as separate things. I think they're intimately tied together. I think that if we don't address the health issues, if we don't do things that limit the damage to our collective health, then that will undermine our economy. There's no two ways about it. I mean, if we stop sheltering in place, open up too quickly, and the virus comes back even stronger, we got an economic problem, even if we don't shut down. Because think about that for a second. I think people will quarantine in place, self quarantine. They'll stop spending, they'll stop going to stores, the businesses will be effectively shut down, even if they're not required to shut down. So I think it's critical that we make sure that we address those health concerns and issues, and we don't make the mistake of opening up too quickly and allowing this virus to gain traction. And I'll say, Asia is a pretty good case study here. Those countries that remain vigilant with regard to their lockdowns have navigated through well. Taiwan, Korea, those economies are actually doing quite well because they don't have the same health issues that places in Southeast Asia have. Go to Singapore, and Singapore is a very disconcerting case because that's 7 million people that are under very strict control by the government. The government has very strong ability to manage the population there and what people do. Yet they have a problem. They had to shut down again. So I don't view these things as separate. I view them as one and the same. We have to make sure that we get the health issues right and contain this virus. Otherwise, our economy is going to be a mess. And I'll say one more thing. In my view, if we get to a second wave that is significant, comparable to the first wave we just experienced and are still experiencing. I mean, new cases haven't really started to decline nationwide. They're still running 25, 30,000 per day. And that's roughly where we've been now for the last month. So it's not like they've come down. If we have another surge, though, my guess is the hit to the economy will be such that we will be calling this period a Great Depression. And both Natalie and I will be wrong about April being the apex of this shock. It'll turn out to be something else. So I view addressing the healthcare concerns as critical to making sure that our economy can continue to improve going forward. I would not separate them.
Really important message. Thank you. Natalie, your thoughts?
Yeah, Governor, the link that I would make is to think of confidence. So we know that economics runs on confidence, and what we've had in April is a crisis of confidence. And I really think the link between health and economics here is confidence. And if people don't feel safe, they're not going to go out. And so they really are linked. But let's be clear, we can't go another 9 months, 2 years with a lockdown economy. We have to learn to work with this virus. And that's why I think it is prudent that we begin to reactivate the Utah economy and start to turn that dial. Fortunately, we have a state that has an incredible intelligence portal that's got data both on the health of this issue, but also the economics and the societal impacts. And we have a legislative commission that's monitoring it, advising the governor. And so I think that Utah will do a very nice job at turning up that dial. I am optimistic about that.
Just a couple of sort of practical questions. Mark, I opened the news this morning and I'm greeted with a headline that says the last week has been the best week of the stock market in 32 years.
Right.
Can you reconcile that?
Yeah, it's a great question. A few things. One, I don't think the script in the stock market has been completely written here. As you know, we all know, stock markets go up, they go down, they go all around. And I wouldn't count on this being the end of the story. I would not be surprised if we see another significant leg down in stock prices at some point in the not too distant future. Second thing I'd say is, of course, the Federal Reserve has a lot to do with the rally in the equity market, and that's more fundamental, and that's very positive. So I do think we've seen the bottom in stock prices because of what the Federal Reserve has done. They when stock prices hit their low back at the end of March, that was when there was still concern that the financial system was going to be taken out by what was going on in the economy. Unfortunately, the Fed erected that firewall that I talked about, and it insulated the financial system. And since then, we've been improving. So that's a fundamental reason to believe well, stock prices probably will go back down. They're not going back down to below that, that previous low. And the third thing I'd say is, people have a problem with, it's a fundamental issue. What do I do, with my money, with my cash, right? I mean, think about it for a second. I mean, interest rates are at zero, literally zero. And do I really want to, put my money there? I'm getting no return. Do I want to put it into real estate? At this point, certainly not in this environment when people aren't making the rental payments in many parts of the country. We've got a lot of folks that are on forbearance for their mortgage, and what does that mean for future default and house prices? So that leaves you with stocks, and so people are saying, okay, I'm going to hold my nose and I'm going to keep it in the stock market. And the final thing I say, it's a little more cautionary. A lot of what's driving the stock market is more technical in nature. You have a lot of what I'll call momentum players that push things down when they're going down and then push things up when they're going up. So I wouldn't read too much into the higher stock prices today, as I wasn't going to read too much in the very low stock prices that I saw back a few months ago. The reality is probably somewhere in between. The fundamentals are probably somewhere in between. But I'll say one last thing. I don't think anyone should expect to get high returns anywhere on any asset for a long time. That's not the way you're going to be able to save for a rainy day or for retirement. The only way to do that is the old-fashioned way, and that is you're going to have to save, because you're not going to get bailed out by higher returns on a consistent basis anywhere.
Natalie, let's just shift for a moment and talk a bit about another state issue that I know you have spent time at the Gardner Center talking about a bit and thinking about, and that's the whole question of inequality. This is not affecting everyone equally. Any thoughts about that?
Well, we went into this crisis with inequality being, something that's very much changing in our country. I think that this will only exacerbate that. You have a situation where, let's say large tech companies, whether it be in Amazon and others, that this is very advantageous for, and there will be a continued consolidation of, economic might in large companies that are tech oriented and able to adapt to this new world. And so I think that the combination of that consolidation and then the fact that this virus we know is hurting minority communities and let's say tight urban settings, the economic impacts of this are concentrated. And in many ways, that will be another legacy that we're going to have to work with when we get through this difficult time.
Governor, you're on mute. I think on mute. Yeah, unfortunately. Oh, there.
Okay, I think whoever is running, I think we're trading mute and unmute. So I think
sorry.
you can hear me now, can't you?
Yeah, we can hear. Yeah, we can hear the question now. Yeah.
Okay, quickly, Andrea, save me. Let's go to questions.
Excellent. We have a couple questions. We've got some viewers here from some international locations or people who do business in international locations. So one has an international e-commerce business, and they do business in Brazil, Australia, and Russia, where exchange rates are very important. And then we have another viewer from Barcelona who was asking a question about Spain. So really, overall, what countries do you think will come out of this economic retraction first? And are there any things that people should be looking for if they do business internationally?
Mark, we're going to call on you for that one.
Sure. Well, I mean, a lot depends on the virus and the damage it's doing to those particular economies. I do know that many emerging markets, you mentioned Russia and Brazil, are struggling with the virus. The number of infections are rising. And a lot goes to their healthcare systems and the inability of their healthcare systems to manage through something like this. We've had our problems, and we're a very, obviously wealthy, highly developed economy with a very significant healthcare system. So they're getting hit very badly. Also, those emerging markets are getting hammered by the decline in oil and other commodity prices. So unfortunately for energy producers, particularly the oil and natural gas markets, coal, they've been crushed not only by the virus impact on global demand for commodities, oil and those commodities, but also by this inability of the Saudis and the Russians to come to terms on how to rein back in the supply of oil. So it's like two black swans. One energy CEO told me, CEO of an energy company told me, I'm being creamed by two black swans: the virus and this battle between these two largest oil producers in the global oil producers. And that's obviously tough for countries like Russia, the Middle East, and Brazil. Brazil also produces a lot of other commodities that are getting hammered with lower prices. So the currencies of those economies are, as you can imagine, under a lot of pressure. And so I think emerging markets are going to be probably the last to really come out of this. It's going to take a while for them to really tackle the virus, get on the other side of it, and for commodity prices to recover so that they can get their economies back on track. The final thing I'll say is, when you look around the emerging world, a lot does depend on governance. So those emerging economies that have better governments, less corruption and are better managed, independent central bank, they're going to do better than those that don't. So some of the emerging markets we're talking about here, their governance is poor, and so that's going to make it more difficult for them to recover. That you're just not going to see the capital inflows to those economies, because people are going to be very wary of the governance issues around crisis management and economic management.
Hey, and Mark, I'd like to just put a state-by-state touch on that, even though that was more of a global question. But I think it'll be interesting to our viewers. I think Nevada will be the hardest hit state because of their tourism dependence, and right behind them, Hawaii. But that gives you a sense of how different the economies are state to state. And then I'll also add that Utah is an oil exporter, and we do have a important oil and gas industry in our state that's being very hard hit right now. This would be concentrated in the Uinta Basin in the Uinta and Duchesne County.
Just a follow-up question for both of you. Do you see, we've had some discussion in the media about some states not being as well managed as Utah has been over the years, that are in some serious fiscal circumstances, and there's actually even talk about states going bankrupt. Is that a serious threat?
Why don't you speak to it nationally, and I'll give a Utah example.
Oh, you want me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, I am supportive of providing aid to state and local governments that, badly managed, well managed, and everything in between. State governments are getting crushed by this, as you can imagine. And of course, when we say state and local government, what we really mean are police, fire, teacher. These are the things that, when you put it in those terms, you go, oh, that makes a whole lot of sense. We got to help make sure that they get the money that they need. So I think it's a mistake not to help state and local governments at this point in time, because we're going to lay off all those people that we need at a time when we really need them. And it's going to do a lot more damage to the economy, and we're going to lose a lot more jobs when we desperately need those jobs. So that makes no sense to me that you would, go down that path. And to say, oh, don't worry, go bankrupt. I mean, are you kidding? I mean, that means state governments are going to be behind the financial 8 ball forever, because investors are going to say, oh, you're going to go bankrupt. Now you got to pay me a lot more money if you're ever going to borrow from me to finance anything, road, an airport renovation, school, whatever it is. And the cost to us as citizens is going to be measurably higher forever in the future. The one thing that distinguishes the United States of America from anyone else on the planet is we pay our debts. We pay our debts, and when everyone knows that, but by the way, that's a founding principle of the United States of America. When Alexander Hamilton said to the people who financed the revolution, when that debt was trading for 5 cents on the dollar, he said, "I'm going to give you 100 cents on the dollar." That was the best decision ever made, financial decision ever made on the planet, and we've been benefiting from that ever since. And if we give that up, we lose that forever for every generation that's going to follow us. That makes no sense whatsoever. So I think it is incumbent upon lawmakers, Congress, and this administration to come together and pass a piece of legislation that gives, right now the National Governors Association says they need 500 billion. Maybe that's a little more than they actually need, but if I were king for the day, I'd give it to them because that's going to go right to teachers, police, firemen, the emergency responders, healthcare professionals, everybody we need at this point in time. So I think it would be just malpractice, policy malpractice if we didn't help state governments at this point. Sorry, you got me on my soapbox. Yes.
Well, so the local tie on this is something that I think is very complimentary of Utah. I feel like Utah, Mark and Governor Leavitt have been preparing for this for the past 10 years. We have a very prudent and frugal state government, local governments as well. Right now we have what we call a working rainy day fund. Our state has been spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of cash for buildings and roads that they're now going to convert to borrowing. So that's the first infusion of money that our state will get. Mark, we have about $900 million saved away in various budget reserve accounts or rainy day funds to help us through this. Our state has been doing budget stress testing to be ready for this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then lastly, I'll just say I teach public finance here at the University of Utah, and I teach my students that if you want to be a fiscally prudent state, you need to have a AAA bond rating, which we have from all three major rating agencies. You want to have a line item veto, which our governor has. You want to have fiscal notes that are multiple years so that legislators can't hide money away or spending away. You want to have a constitutional limitation on how much you can borrow, which we have. And we even have a spending or appropriation limitation in our state. So Utahns can be very confident in state finances. And then I'm also with Mark, to the degree the federal government helps us, we'll put it to good use.
Well, this has been a remarkable conversation. Mark Zandia, thank you so much for the effort that you made and for your contributions, not just today, but for many years in advising our state. And Natalie, the same with you. I know personally the contributions that you have made through many, many years as an economist and as a leader in the community. So with that, we're going to draw this episode of how to rebuild your business and how to rebuild our community to an end. And I'm going to move back to Dean Taylor Randall, who will bid our farewell and tell you about coming weeks.
Governor Leavitt, thanks for being such a great moderator today. And again, we thank Natalie Gochner and Mark Zandy for being on, and thank all of you listeners today as well. Hope you picked up a forecast that you can use in your businesses and your planning. On Tuesday, we're going to have a special session for the construction industry in the state of Utah, construction and real estate, and hope that you'll join us for that. That'll be very industry specific. Next Friday, we're going to be talking about building confidence during this next phase of recovery. Confidence both in society and confidence in your customers, as well as confidence in your employees, because we know confidence is going to be a big part of this recovery. Thanks again to the George S. and Dolores Dory Eccles Foundation for making this possible. Keep your wits about you. We're going to get through this together. Thank you.